The air in the churchyard was cold that afternoon, the kind of dry Utah chill that seemed to pull the warmth right out of your bones. But Lawrence didn't shiver. He stood at the edge of the gravel path, watching the last mourners drift toward their cars, their voices low, their shoes crunching over small stones. No one asked if he needed a ride home. Not even Eric, his son-in-law, who had handled every detail of the service with an efficiency that felt more like a corporate event than a farewell to a wife of 43 years. Margaret would have hated it. No soft music, no messy laughter through tears, no clumsy hugs from neighbors, just perfect flower arrangements, a slideshow timed to the second, and paper cups of coffee lined up like a board meeting break. Lawrence lingered in the garden long after the folding chairs had been stacked and the scent of lilies began to fade. When he finally stepped back into the house, Eric was at the dining table, sliding papers into a leather folder without looking up. "We'll start the legal process next week," Eric said flatly, as if Lawrence had no say in the matter. Then he reached for a small velvet box, held it out, and said, "She wanted you to have this." Inside was a single silver cufflink, just one, not even a set, and no note. Margaret had drawers of journals, letters, postcards from trips they'd taken, yet this was all he was given. Eric smiled politely, almost like he'd just checked off the last task on a list, and walked out the door. That night, Lawrence sat in the quiet kitchen with a cooling cup of tea, staring at the cufflink on the table. For the first time since Margaret passed, he felt like a stranger in the home they had built together. The same home where her books still lined the hallway and her coat still hung by the door. He tried to tell himself it was just grief, but deep down, something else had shifted, something colder. 2 days later, an email arrived from Eric's assistant, not even from Eric himself. A state administration meeting, Wednesday, 9 a.m. No greeting, no hope you're holding up, just a time and a place, like a dental appointment. On the morning of the meeting, Lawrence sat in traffic twice, debating whether to turn back, but eventually he found himself in a sleek downtown office, smelling faintly of eucalyptus and printer ink. The receptionist led him into a glass-walled conference room where 7 people sat in dark suits. Eric, at the head of the table, didn't greet him, only gave a small nod toward the lone, empty chair at the far end. Lawrence listened in silence as Eric listed Margaret's assets, stocks, 2 commercial properties, and a vineyard in California, before announcing, with a measured tone, that primary control of the family trust was transferred to me 6 months ago. When an associate asked about Lawrence's share, Eric replied without looking up, "There are no remaining distributions assigned to him." Heat climbed up Lawrence's spine, but he kept his hands folded. No one spoke. The meeting moved on as if his name had never existed. The next morning, Lawrence woke before sunrise, the desert sky outside still a deep slate blue, the mountains in the distance only just taking shape. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee untouched, staring at the cufflink, turning it slowly between his fingers. He had no plan, only a growing certainty that what happened in that conference room wasn't a mistake or oversight. It was deliberate. He thought of Margaret's steady handwriting, the way she always made notes in the margins of every important document, and how she had told him once, "We'll make sure you never have to worry, Larry." Now, he had been erased as if he'd never existed in her plans. By mid-morning, he picked up the phone and called Daniel Briggs, a long-retired attorney and one of Margaret's oldest friends. They hadn't spoken in years, but Daniel's voice was the same, measured, deliberate, with a tone that made you feel steadier just hearing it. They agreed to meet at a small diner off Main Street, the kind with cracked red vinyl booths and a faint smell of bacon grease in the air. When Lawrence slid into the booth across from him, Daniel didn't waste time on small talk. "Tell me everything," he said, and Lawrence did, starting from the funeral, the box, the cufflink, the meeting. When Lawrence pushed the small folder he'd found in Margaret's study across the table, Daniel adjusted his glasses and began to read. Margaret's note was short but heavy. "Eric wants me to change the will. I don't trust this. I haven't told Lawrence yet." Then came the photocopy of a will Lawrence had never seen before, his name crossed out in red pen, a note scribbled in the margin, "Discuss with Eric." Daniel's brow furrowed deeper with every page. "This isn't sloppy paperwork," he said finally, setting the papers down. This is intentional. He pulled a small notepad from his coat pocket and began writing. Dates, law firms mentioned by Eric, the names of the witnesses on the will. Lawrence didn't recognize either of them, and Margaret had always used familiar faces for such things. Daniel tapped the witness names and said, "I'll look into these." They decided to move quietly. No confrontation with Eric, not yet. Daniel wanted to start by confirming the most recent will on file with the county, then compare it to any older versions. That afternoon, back at home, Lawrence went through Margaret's desk again, this time methodically. He flipped through old checkbooks, greeting cards, travel itineraries, until he came across her leather-bound calendar. There, in late spring, a name was circled twice: Hal Givens. Lawrence remembered Hal, a tax consultant they had met through a local nonprofit years earlier. He hadn't seen him in ages. When Lawrence called Daniel with the name, Daniel said he'd reach out discreetly. The next day, Daniel called back with news. Hal remembered Margaret visiting his office weeks before she died. She had been thin, tired, but sharp, asking specific questions about protecting Lawrence's future. Questions about housing, legal rights, and financial security. Hal told her he could help set up a review to ensure everything was in order. But a week later, Eric called to cancel the appointment, saying Margaret no longer needed those services. Hal still had the intake notes. They weren't legally binding, but they proved intent, that Margaret wanted Lawrence protected, that she was actively working toward it, and that Eric had intervened. Daniel suggested they bring in a probate litigation specialist, someone who knew the patterns of contested wills. The next day, Lawrence sat across from Lydia Velasquez in Daniel's small office. Lydia was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, dressed simply, and she read the documents without a flicker of emotion. "The witnesses on this will," she said finally, tapping the page, "have come up before, in other suspicious cases." She explained that she could file a motion to preserve the estate, which would temporarily freeze any transfers or sales of property until the matter was reviewed by a court. Lawrence nodded. It wasn't revenge he was after. He wanted space, room to breathe, and to uncover what had really happened. 2 days later, Lydia called with news. The judge had approved the motion. Eric could not move funds or property without the court's knowledge. Lawrence stood by the window of his living room after hanging up, watching the thin winter light move across the mountains. It wasn't victory, but it was the first step towards something solid. For the first time since Margaret's funeral, the ground beneath him felt a little less like it was shifting. But in that steadiness, a new thought formed, quiet but certain. If Eric had gone this far to remove him, there was more he hadn't seen yet. The next week passed in a strange rhythm. Lawrence moving through ordinary tasks, buying groceries, raking the thin crust of snow from the porch steps, while beneath it all, a quiet current of anticipation pushed him forward. Lydia had promised to start pulling on threads, and one of those threads led to someone Lawrence hadn't expected. A young legal assistant named Ava Kendall, who had worked for Eric. Daniel arranged for her to meet them at his office, and Lawrence arrived early that morning, the air outside crisp and pale with the first hint of snow. Inside, the conference room was warm, a pot of coffee steaming on the side table. Ava walked in, right on time, mid-30s, hair pulled back, wearing a gray cardigan and dark jeans. Her eyes darted around the room before settling on the folder Lydia had placed in front of her. Lydia explained that Ava was under no obligation to accuse anyone, only to share what she'd personally witnessed. Ava nodded, took a sip of coffee, and began. She told them that about 6 weeks before Margaret died, Eric had come into the office with a stack of estate documents and an urgency that felt off. Normally, she explained, revisions to a will or trust for someone of Margaret's standing would involve multiple review sessions, scheduled signings, and notarizations with the person physically present. But in this case, things moved quickly. Too quickly. One night, Ava had stayed late to retrieve her jacket and found Eric in the conference room with another staffer. There were unsigned forms on the table, and he asked her to witness a signature. "Where's Margaret?" she had asked. Eric, without looking up, said she had just stepped out and that it was urgent. Ava hesitated but signed where he indicated. Later, in her personal planner, she made a note of it. Sunday, 7:43 p.m. Witnessed signature for Eric. No Margaret present. She also recalled another moment that stayed with her. 2 days before Margaret was hospitalized for the final time, Ava overheard Eric on a phone call in his office, saying, "Liquidate quietly. No delays." She didn't know the context, but the words were sharp, calculated. At the time, she told herself it was none of her business. Eric was powerful in the office, and she had a mortgage and a child to support. But now, seeing the documents and hearing what Lawrence had been told, she realized the weight of those moments. Ava reached into her bag and pulled out the actual planner page, along with metadata printouts from the office system showing that the will file's signature date didn't match the building's access logs. Margaret hadn't entered the office that weekend at all. Lydia's eyes flickered with something Lawrence couldn't quite read. Satisfaction, perhaps, or the steady focus of someone seeing a puzzle piece snap into place. "This isn't carelessness," she said quietly. "This is construction." Daniel leaned back, hands folded, and for the first time since this began, Lawrence saw relief in his old friend's face. Ava signed a statement and left quickly, her steps brisk, as though saying the words aloud had lifted something heavy from her shoulders. That afternoon, Eric's attorney sent Lawrence a letter, polished, cold, accusing him of interfering with a lawful estate transfer and threatening legal costs if he didn't withdraw his motion within 10 business days. Lawrence read it 3 times over his morning coffee, folded it neatly, and set it beside the cufflink on the table. Then he called Daniel. "I've been more than okay for years," he said. "I've just been quiet, but silence isn't surrender." Daniel chuckled low. "That's the best thing I've heard all week." Lydia filed their rebuttal that afternoon, attaching Ava's notes, the metadata proof, and Margaret's earlier drafts, the one where his name had been crossed out in red ink, the margin note saying, "Discuss with Eric," still visible. It was no longer just suspicion. It was evidence. With the motion already filed, they could now request internal communications from Eric's firm, financial records, and even deposition dates for those involved in the document changes. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, signatures, and scanned files. Lawrence stayed out of the way, spending his evenings walking the neighborhood, the crisp mountain air biting at his cheeks. He noticed small things he hadn't paid attention to in years. The faint smell of wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney, the sound of the creek behind the old mill thawing in the afternoon sun. One evening, he passed the bench in the park where he and Margaret used to sit with coffee, talking about nothing and everything. The thought that she might have sensed all this and kept it to herself hurt more than the betrayal itself. But another thought anchored him. If she had been too ill to fight it, then it was his fight now. By Thursday, Lydia had prepared the first subpoenas, one aimed directly at Eric's assistant, who had notarized the contested documents. Daniel noticed something in the digital signatures. 2 of them were logged on a Sunday night when the office was supposedly closed. Lawrence stared at the detail, his fingers tightening around the paper. Margaret hated working on weekends. She never signed anything without reading it slowly, often aloud. The idea that her signature might have been forged made his stomach turn, but it also hardened something inside him. Lydia moved quickly, requesting a forensic handwriting expert to compare Margaret's known medical file signatures with those on the updated will. It wouldn't be definitive, but it would be enough to plant serious doubt in the court's mind. That night, Lawrence sat alone on his porch. The Wasatch Range spread dark and solid against the winter sky. Somewhere out there, snow was falling in the higher peaks, silent and steady, reshaping the slopes without anyone watching. He realized that was what they were doing, reshaping the story Eric had tried to set in stone. Not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, piece by piece, until the shape of the truth was visible again. He thought of Margaret's note, her hesitation, her instinct to protect him, even as she grew weaker. The fight ahead might be long, but the worst of the silence had already been broken. 3 days later, a cream-colored envelope appeared in Lawrence's mailbox, no stamp, just slid in by hand. Inside was an invitation, printed in embossed gold letters, to a tribute to Margaret Carter at the Mountain Ridge Country Club, cocktails, an auction, speeches. The event was only 4 days away. There was no note from Eric, just the formal card. Lawrence stared at it over his coffee. It wasn't grief that made him decide to attend. It was the pull of presence. He wouldn't stand outside and let someone else tell Margaret's story without him. On Saturday evening, he put on the navy blazer Margaret had bought him for their 40th anniversary, polished his shoes, and drove to the club through streets still wet from a light afternoon snow. The parking lot was full. Inside, the air was warm, carrying the faint scent of pine from enormous garlands draped over the banisters. The ballroom gleamed, polished wood floors, tall floral arrangements, a photo of Margaret framed in gold by the entrance. Lawrence recognized it instantly. It was from a family reunion years ago, one where she'd been tired, her smile faint. He hated that Eric had chosen that one. Across the room, Eric stood in a tailored suit, greeting guests with a half-tilt of his head, all charm and poise. When his eyes met Lawrence's, the smile tightened just enough for Lawrence to notice. Lawrence moved toward the auction tables, where items were displayed as Margaret's favorites. A vintage book he had given her on their first trip to Denver, a signed baseball they'd bought together at a charity game. His name was nowhere on the labels. A man in a charcoal suit approached, introduced himself as one of Margaret's former business partners, and asked casually how Lawrence was managing the trust. Lawrence told him the truth, that he was no longer the trustee. The man's expression flickered with surprise before smoothing back into polite neutrality. A few minutes later, Lawrence found himself speaking with one of Margaret's old board colleagues, a woman named Helen. In the midst of their conversation, she mentioned almost in passing that Eric had sent an email weeks before Margaret passed, outlining managing partner responsibilities and including suggested donation amounts for upcoming projects. It was a small detail, but to Lawrence it felt like a crack in the wall, proof Eric had been moving to take control before Margaret was even gone. The next morning, Lawrence met Daniel and Lydia at Daniel's office, handing over every note he'd made from the night before. Lydia listened, then said, "This isn't just inheritance theft. This is premeditated control." She outlined the next step, filing a formal motion to challenge the will on grounds of fraud and undue influence. 2 weeks later, the date was set for the preliminary hearing at the Salt Lake Probate Court. Lawrence arrived early, wearing his dark overcoat, and took a seat at the long table opposite Eric. Eric leaned back in his chair, smiling as though he'd already won. The judge entered, and the lawyer for the estate began to read the will aloud. Stocks, properties, bank accounts. Lawrence's name never came up. Eric's eyes stayed on him, steady, almost daring him to react. Then, mid-sentence, the lawyer paused. He set the pages down, leaned back slightly, and gave a short, dry laugh. "Interesting," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet courtroom. "This is the version you filed?" Eric nodded smoothly. The lawyer reached into his briefcase and pulled out another document, a notarized earlier version of the will, signed and dated months before the revision Eric had submitted. This version clearly named Lawrence as co-beneficiary and lifelong co-trustee, with survivor protections that matched Margaret's original estate plan. Alongside it were Ava's signed statement, the office building's access logs, and Hal Given's intake notes, all stapled neatly into the file. "Given these discrepancies," the lawyer said, glancing at the judge, "a full forensic review will be necessary before any distributions can proceed. Until then, Mr. Carter remains the legal co-trustee of the estate." Eric's smile faltered, the corners of his mouth tightening. Lawrence kept his hands folded, his face calm. He didn't gloat, didn't even let relief show. The truth, now part of the record, spoke for itself. Outside the courthouse, Daniel clapped him on the shoulder. "You didn't just win a round," he said. "You put the real story back where it belongs." That evening, Lawrence sat on his porch, the chill of the Utah winter settling in as the sun dropped behind the mountains. He thought of Margaret's careful notes, her unspoken doubts, and how close her voice had come to being erased. Now it was written back into the story, not loudly, but permanently. The fight wasn't over, but the ground beneath his feet no longer felt like it could give way at any second. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to breathe deeply and let the cold air fill his lungs. He had come to the courthouse with nothing but steady resolve. He left with proof that Margaret's last wishes had not been forgotten. And somewhere inside him, he knew the real reckoning for Eric was only just beginning. The week after the hearing was quiet in the way fresh snow mutes every sound. But Lawrence didn't mistake silence for peace. Lydia had warned him that this was often when the other side regrouped, and sure enough, by Thursday, an official letter arrived from Eric's attorney. It accused Lawrence of disrupting the lawful administration of the estate and claimed he was acting out of grief and misunderstanding, threatening to pursue legal costs unless he withdrew his challenge within 10 business days. Lawrence read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it beside the cufflink still resting on the kitchen table. He didn't feel rattled. He felt anchored. The decision to keep going had been made weeks ago, and no letter could shake it. That afternoon, Lydia submitted a full rebuttal, attaching Ava's planner entry, the office access logs, Hal Given's notes, and the original will with his name intact. She also filed a request for complete discovery, internal communications from Eric's firm, metadata from the estate documents, and deposition dates for the two unknown witnesses. 3 days later, a different kind of envelope appeared, this one from the estate board, co-signed by one of Margaret's oldest partners, inviting Lawrence to a meeting to finalize the transfer of executive authority. There was no mention of the challenge, no acknowledgement that the court had already frozen the estate. It read like a victory lap for Eric. Lawrence decided to attend, not to argue, but to be seen. On the day of the meeting, he arrived at the glass and marble building downtown 5 minutes early. Inside the conference room, he recognized faces from past foundation banquets, people who had once called him Larry over catered dinners. At the head of the table sat Eric, in a dark blue suit, hair perfectly combed, smiling faintly as though rehearsing for a photograph. The meeting moved quickly, donations, upcoming events, until they reached the agenda item for transition of executive oversight. Eric spoke at length about Margaret's vision, then turned toward Lawrence with a practiced smile and said, "And now, with your grace, I carry it forward." The phrasing was deliberate, a subtle rewriting of history that suggested Lawrence had willingly stepped aside. He felt the weight of the moment, but didn't speak. Instead, he reached into his briefcase and slid a sealed envelope down the table to Margaret's oldest friend on the board. Inside were copies of Ava's signed statement, the access logs, and the page from the original will Eric had altered. The envelope moved from one set of hands to the next, quiet as a whisper. By the time it reached the far end, Eric's smile had tightened into a line. Lawrence stood, thanked the board for their time, and said, "If anyone here needs clarification, my attorney will be in touch." Then he left, not in a hurry, not in anger, but with the calm of someone who had placed truth in the middle of the table and walked away. 2 days later, Lydia called. The board had postponed their vote and requested an independent review of the estate amendments. Eric's lawyer went silent. In that pause, Lawrence felt a shift, not a legal victory yet, but a crack in the facade. Over the following week, he focused on preserving Margaret's legacy. He pulled out the foundation's original charter, early grant proposals they'd written together, and programs from scholarship award nights. He took them to Daniel's office to be archived properly, ensuring they would outlive the legal battle. Then, on a Saturday afternoon, with the Wasatch Peaks bright under a pale winter sun, Lawrence visited the community garden he and Margaret had helped fund years earlier. The groundskeeper had already planted early bulbs beneath the frost. He stood by the plaque they'd unveiled at the ribbon cutting, the words still clear despite the weather. "In honor of those who plant for a future they may never see." He thought of Margaret's quiet strength, of Ava's decision to speak up, of Lydia and Daniel's persistence, and of the way Eric's control had begun to unravel once light hit the paper trail. Weeks later, the foundation held its annual donor luncheon. Lawrence hadn't planned to go, but when the cream envelope arrived, listing his name among the honored guests, he decided to attend. He wore a gray suit and pinned to his lapel a small silver oak tree brooch Margaret had once bought at a craft fair. Steady, rooted, quiet. The ballroom looked the same as years past, polished floors, soft music. But Eric was nowhere on the program. Near the end of the event, a young board member named Lee took the stage and, without fanfare, spoke of the foundation's early days, Margaret's original mission, and the quiet resolve of those who had protected it. She said Lawrence's name with warmth, and the room turned toward him in a wave of gentle applause. He stood briefly, nodded, and sat back down. It wasn't about recognition. It was about being restored to the story. That night, walking home through the crisp Utah air, he passed the old bookstore where Margaret used to linger on Sundays. In the front window sat a display of vintage books, and there, in the center, was the same edition he'd once given her, its spine catching the light. He stopped, smiled, and for the first time since the funeral, felt completely at home in his own life. Margaret's voice, erased on paper but never in truth, was still here, in the garden, in the foundation, in the friends who refused to look away. And so was he.